Thanks for joining us for our second pre-concert video of this 2022-23 season of the Holland Symphony. This concert features music for orchestra and organ, and we're going to sample some American composers and a French composer. Before we talk about the pieces, we do want to wish Hugh Lewis well. He was supposed to be the soloist for this concert. Has been recovering from a really terrible bout of COVID, and then to make things even worse last weekend, broke a couple of fingers. So we're sorry that he's not with us. We're trying to get him back on our schedule to play the Barber as soon as we can, get everyone's schedule together. But we're delighted to welcome Peter Kurgel to the organ bench to play the Sanson. He is a former student of Hugh Lewis's. He's currently the organist and choir master and a lot of other things at the Basilica of St. Adalbert in Grand Rapids. So he's a graduate of Hope College, and he really likes the organ in the Jack Miller Concert Hall. So we're grateful to have him step in at the very last minute and play the Sanson with us. And we'll do the Barber again as soon as we can, as soon as we can all get on the same page. But the first half of the concert, we feature two very different American composers. We start off with a piece by Florence Price, who was an African-American composer born in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1887, and she lived until 1953. She grew up in a fairly prominent family in Little Rock. Her dad was a dentist, a very well-respected family. She did a lot of music with her family, showed a lot of early talent. Went to New England Conservatory, where she studied composition and music education, several other things, music related, taught at a college in Atlanta for a while, and then got married and moved with her husband back to Little Rock, where she raised a couple of daughters. Had trouble finding work in Little Rock. That was a rough time to be in Little Rock. It was a very segregated, and in fact, a lot of really tense racial incidents, including terrible lynching, had them rethink living in Little Rock, and they moved to Chicago, where she really got very well immersed in the music scene in Chicago. Did all kinds of things, studied at a lot of different places with a lot of people, and that's where she really started composing. Along the way, her husband left her, and she was then suddenly a single mother, so she played organ for a lot of silent film screenings, not screamings, and wrote a lot of little jingles for ads and things. Did that all under a pen name. Really was a very prolific composer, wrote over 300 works, I believe, and most of them were lost until 2009 in a dilapidated house that she had used as a summer home toward the end of her life in St. Anne, Illinois. This totally run-down, abandoned house. Someone literally discovered over 200 pieces, scores, different pieces of her work. And it's all recently been published, so lots of people have been excited about Florence Price and performing her music. And the piece we're going to play, this overture, is one of those pieces that was discovered in 2009 in this run-down, abandoned house. So we're glad someone made that discovery and didn't just tear down the house before checking it out inside. Johannes, what do we need to know about the piece?
Well, like you said, she was the major tie-in in this program between all those pieces is organ, right? As you mentioned, she was a trained organist, and of course, Saint-Saëns was, a concert organist, and then Howard Hansen was the director of the Eastman School that is also famous for their organ program. So that's kind of the tie-in from a holistic perspective. I guess historically what's also interesting is that her works, her spirituals, her settings of spirituals were also composed by, the century's greats, like Leontine Price was champion of her work. And she was also the first African-American woman to have her symphony performed by a major orchestra, the Chicago Symphony, in June 1933, played her Symphony No. 1. and in E minor. And that is also the symphony that one of my conducting students chose to feature in her master's thesis. So I've gotten introduced to Price's music through one of my students a few years ago, and I really, enjoyed the process of working on that piece. So about this piece, well, it features the three spirituals that you mentioned. I would also say that it's a very unique American sound. The same for Howard Hanson. The first half is really uniquely American. I would say there are some romantic gestures and some very warm sounds. There's also rhythm with a particular continental flavor, and then the spirituals get coded and they get treated, among the orchestra. But it's not very hard to discover it in the texture. The other thing I would say, historically speaking, like Dvorak, when he visited the States, he mentioned, American composers shouldn't try to copy Europeans, but you should really focus on the authentic voice of the African-American culture. And a lot of people say, well, in Dvorak's slow movement in the New World Symphony, you find, spirituals. And so there's kind of an interesting example of cross-pollination where she adapted some of Dvorak's, I would say, orchestration. It sounds sort of very similar in terms of how she orchestrates and builds texture. But then she also, I think she was aware of Dvorak's visit to the States, and also William Grant Still really used their particular access to African-American spirituals and incorporated that into the music, and sort of found this uniquely American voice. And I'm, like you said, I'm so glad that the publishers decided to make these parts, and a lot of orchestras are now rediscovering this music. And then we're not the only orchestra that features Florence Price. So I'm happy there's sort of a resurgence of that music.
It's a very listenable piece. I think,
Super.
If anyone who knows these spirituals will instantly recognize them, and may even be a little hard not to sort of hum along.
Right.
But it's a delightful piece. I'm looking forward to playing it. I've not played this piece before. I have played the other two pieces. When we knew that Hugh Lewis was not able to join us, we tried to figure out what we could put in place of the Barber Toccata that was used the same instrumentation. In other words, we didn't want to have to go out and hire 5 more people. The Sanson and the price call for a fairly large orchestra, so we had a lot of forces we could draw upon already. We were looking for something with a similar length, and this is a couple minutes longer than the Barber, but pretty close. And maybe a similar flavor. So Samuel Barber's an American composer, and so is Howard Hanson. Howard Hanson, this Symphony No. 2, I know most because the main theme of the symphony is he actually donated that to Interlaken, and that is the now known as the Interlaken theme, and they play that at the end of every concert at the Interlaken camp. But I know it's Johannes has a connection to Howard Hanson due to Eastman.
Yeah, and I have a connection to this particular symphony too. So it turns out that I'm going to just start with that. It turns out that when I was finishing my doctoral studies at Eastman, and I got the invitation to be a finalist for the job out in Long Beach, my audition piece was Howard Hanson's Second Symphony. And I did not know. I mean, of course, Hanson was the director of the Eastman School for many, many years, and sort of the founding builder of the music program. But so I just went down to the stacks because I didn't have a score, and I just looked at under H, and I grabbed Hanson's score of the Second Symphony. And so I took that, studied it, went to Long Beach, and then I conducted the rehearsal. And then there was a question that apparently all the candidates were asked, and I was the final candidate. That said, in measure 263, is that a B flat or a B natural? And I said, well, it's a B flat. And they said, well, the other candidates weren't so sure. How come you're so sure? I said, well, because I'm using Hanson's score, and there's a big handwritten flat right in front of that B. So that was kind of funny, and I did end up getting the job, but maybe not because of that. So
you have the authoritative version.
Exactly. So Howard Hansen, I don't know if you want to talk about a little bit of background, but he was born, 9 years after Price, and was an American composer, conductor, educator, music theorist, and champion of American music. And as I mentioned, he was director of the Eastman School for 40 years, and he really built that school, right, and provided opportunities for commissioning and performing American music. Born in Nebraska to Swedish immigrant parents, Hans and Hilma Ekström Hansen. And in his youth, he studied with his mother, later received a diploma in 1911 and studied at the Institute of Musical Art, which was the forerunner of the Juilliard School in New York. Then afterwards, he went to Northwestern University and studied throughout his life. He studied piano, cello, and trombone, so not organ. But George Eastman, of course, had a love for organ, had an organ in his home, and really insisted on building a great organ program. So Hansen became familiar with the organ and wrote an organ concerto, which I think we did in 2015.
We have played that.
Yeah. There's this big famous pedal cadenza, and so that's a fun work to do. And he wrote a number of orchestral and chamber works, among them the Scandinavian Suite, celebrating his Lutheran and Scandinavian heritage. In 1921, he was the first winner of the Prix de Rome, and so he was able to go to Italy and study and sort of take a break from all his teaching. And this is where he wrote his first symphony, the Nordic Symphony. And it was later when he conducted that in Rochester as the guest conductor in 1924 that George Eastman heard him and said, this guy, there's something about him. And he, as the philanthropist who funded the Eastman School, he could just pick the next director. So, and it was then Eastman who decided, this is what we want to build. And I want to have an American school that features American composers, and it's not just a European copy. And so Hansen followed that, and he premiered many American works. And sort of the tie-in with Saint-Saëns is that Saint-Saëns was also, when he founded this musical society in France, to feature more French works because it was so German dominant. Sort of a similar situation here where Hansen said, it's so European dominant, we need to do more American work. So on Mercury Records back in the day, and with the Eastman Rochester Philharmonic, he recorded many, many American works. And William Grant Still, Walter Piston, Charles Griffith. So there's lots of investment into young American composers. And of course, the Second Symphony he wrote to celebrate, it was a commission from Sergei Koussevitzky for the 50th anniversary of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. And this work then later was labeled the Romantic Symphony because there's kind of a warm character. So it's in 3 movements. Another tie-in in this program is we have unusual number of movements. The Saint-Saëns only has 2 movements labeled, but there actually are 4 movements, and the Hansen only has 3 movements. So there was some criticism by some avant-garde composers, like Virgil Thompson, for instance, was highly critical and said, there's nothing new here, no adventure. Everybody feels like they already know the piece because it is so conservative. But I think for most audiences who have not heard it before, they will immediately like it. There's a certain warmth and comfort in it. But I think the American flavor is the use of 4ths and 5ths, musically speaking, sort of projecting a kind of openness of texture. Copland was famous for that too. Copland maybe was a little bit more extreme. Here, I would say you have a European colored American flavored music that is instantly likable and is in fact very romantic, I would say. It sounds very warm.
Yeah, I'm struck in this symphony by the long themes that build over many seconds, longer than some composers, but this very long gradual ascent and then descent into the theme. So there are some just long trajectory themes in this that are just really marvelous and enjoyable. And you just, by the time you get to the climax of the theme, you're you're sort of just like reading a good book, sort of, wondering what's going to happen by the time you get to the end. Maybe another tie-in, not an intentional tie-in, is that Hansen really featured one theme in this symphony, and that is, of course, the theme that was donated to Interlaken and became the Interlaken theme. But that shows up in all movements.
That theme was also used in the closing credits of the movie Alien in 1979 without his permission. Hansen did not like that, but he decided not to fight it in court. But then also John Williams used the symphony as a model for his music of E.T. So there's kind of a Hollywood tie-in also. It's not a direct quote, but there are some shimmers, and John Williams is basically sort of a product of Korngold, and there's a little bit of Hansen. So whatever was in the air, Korngold, during that time, John Williams was able to recycle that into his great language of movie music.
Okay, I'm not crazy, because we did E.T. at our August concert, and I have been working on this, but I almost feel like I hear a little E.T. in here.
Yep.
A couple of times. Good. I feel more validated.
Yeah, you're not making stuff up, right?
Back to the one theme thing. The French composers loved thematic development. That might be the term we would use. Franz Liszt is someone who really championed that. In other words, you have a theme, and how many different ways can you work over that theme over the course of a large piece? Perhaps the most obvious French composer who does that is Hector Berlioz in his Symphonie Fantastique. And you'll hear that in a few weeks at our October concert. But Saint-Saëns definitely takes that theme and features it in every movement of this piece in some different ways. And so because you really don't want me to sing it, I have my violin here, and so I thought maybe I'd play the theme and then show you what it sounds like in the various movements. I'll see if I can do this quickly. Some people actually think this theme comes from the Dies Irae chant, which sounds like that'd be the first couple notes of that Dies Irae famous chant that is associated with the Requiem and death and apocalypse and all that good stuff. So Saint-Saëns takes that. Here's how the theme appears right toward the beginning of his first movement. Many times, sometimes with faster notes, slower notes, but that's the theme. Very chromatic, minor, not a big range of in the theme. It's all pretty. The notes are all pretty close together. They're all about a fourth apart. So you hear that a lot in the first movement. That's a lot of what the strings play in the first movement. Many times. Johannes said this piece is in two movements, which is really true, but each of those movements is in two distinct sections. So in a way, Saint-Saëns fully admits that he wrote two movements, but it does follow the basic four-movement plan of a symphony. So the second part of the first movement, which we might call the second movement, is a beautiful slow movement. Could easily, it's so romantic sounding and emotive that it could easily be a piece of music that would appear on a soundtrack. But in the middle, the theme is not as obvious. It's almost more accompanimental in its pizzicato. Let's see if I can find it. So not as obvious, it's subtle, but the theme is there. It's almost all the same notes. It gets a little bit weirder as the movement goes on here and there. The third movement, or we could call it the second main movement, has a scherzo feel. Some people feel like the beginning of the movement, Saint-Saëns takes that theme and turns it upside down. to remind you what the theme sounded like back from the first movement. So maybe a more obvious way that Saint-Saëns plays with that in this third movement, the scherzo part, is a little sort of, it's not the main tune, but it comes in here and there, again, in a slightly different key. Pretty much the same notes, the same intervals, a few slight variations in a different key, but the same material. And then in the last movement, which is where you'll know when we get to the last movement, because that's when the organ is very, very apparent. The organ does play earlier in the piece, but it's pretty quiet and subtle. So he takes this very minor, sort of creepy sounding chromatic theme and makes it major. First, it appears as a chorale. Sorry about that. I can't find my place in the music. He does it grander and all sorts of different ways, and he also makes it the subject of a fugue, which is a theme that is played once in one section of the orchestra and then repeated again by a different section, and they overlap, and that sounds like this. And then another section of the orchestra would take that over and the violins go on and play something else. So it's really fascinating to me, all the different ways he takes that theme and manipulates it, faster, slower, pizzicato, either as the main melody or sort of an accompaniment figure, major and minor, grand, quiet, lyrical. It's a lot of fun to trace that theme throughout the piece. Johannes, what's challenging about playing this or putting it together, conducting it? What's different about having an organ in the mix?
Yeah, I mean, people who attended our Classics Up Close concert, they will, which was an all French program. This is very different French, right? The first one was more intimate. This is large textures, right? So just moving a massive orchestra around, getting used to the organ in the room, having the organist play with the orchestra. There's also piano, forehand piano, so there are lots of forces. So in a way, this is almost like conducting Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, where you've got lots of moving parts. It's very different from intricate, smaller forces. Also, like you mentioned in the 6/8 section in the scherzo, that is very tricky, and with a large string section to get that clean, that is also hard. So the challenges are those of a large ensemble. I would say, historically speaking, this was kind of, it's the last symphony Saint-Saëns wrote. It's symphony number 3, but it's actually number 5 because the first 2 weren't recorded. And he was done. He said, I've said all I need to say. And music, the French of that time, Franck and Dandy, they really liked the more Wagner flavored music. And even Charles Gounod, he exclaimed once when Saint-Saëns was conducting this symphony and was mounting the podium, he loudly said, "Here is the Beethoven of France." And that was not a compliment. It was like, conservative symphonic textures rather than tone poems, which were now en vogue, right? So it is, it's conservative, almost like J.S. Bach, right? J.S. Bach, in his final years, was seen as the conservative who has already been surpassed by all these modern composers who kept on writing in these old forms. Same here. Saint-Saëns was seen as a conservative, but I think there's so much craft in this, so much care for structure. It's really 2 movements on paper only, so that's not really innovative. But just the colors and the forces and the craft really appeals to me, and it's a work that we do, from time to time. We keep it in the canon, is definitely his most famous work. But he was also a concert organist. He wrote tons of concertos that people play. You know, he knew how to write for instruments. And it, you know, once you get past the intricacies of dealing with a large orchestra and playing it together, it's well written. So definitely lots of craft, and I don't mind that he is the Beethoven of France. To me, that's a compliment because he knew how to write music.
I think a lot of us looking back now sort of enjoy some of this throwback music. We appreciate the romantic, the just nice melodies, beautiful, colorful orchestrations. So we are really looking forward to this concert. Thanks for joining us for this video. We hope you enjoy the concert. Again, if you have any questions about upcoming concerts and would like to have us address those in a video, we probably need to get your question by about a week before the concert, which is when we record these. You can always email hso@hollandsymphony.org. But thanks again for watching. We'll see you on September 24.